Storybook reading of Elijah stories. The Long Drought. One day, God's prophet Elijah went boldly to King Ahab and said, I tell you, in God's name, there will be no rain in the land for more than 2 years. None will fall until I give the word. You will learn that my God is the true God. He still has power in Israel. In such a hot, dry country, rain was very precious. When none fell, the young grain and the green vegetables began to wither and shrivel away. Food soon grew scarce. Jezebel's Baal was supposed to be the god of rain, but however much they prayed to him, the rain did not come. Ahab and Jezebel were very angry with Elijah. They would have liked to kill him. Go and hide from the king by the Cherith brook on the other side of the Jordan, God told Elijah. I will order ravens to bring you food. Elijah did as God said. He stayed well hidden, drinking water from the brook and waiting morning and evening for the strange bird visitors to arrive with his breakfast and dinner. The huge black ravens flew to him with meat and bread in their beaks and claws. Elijah ate the food thankfully. Still the sun beat down, and still no rain fell. The brook began to dry up until Cherith became an empty stream bed. Elijah, God said, it's time now to leave here and go to Zarephath. There is a widow there who will feed you. Elijah tramped north beyond the country of Israel into Sidon, the home of the wicked Queen Jezebel. Just outside the town gate of Zarephath, he saw a woman bending down to pick up sticks for firewood. He knew at once that this was the woman God had told him about, the food that never ran out. Elijah walked across to the woman who was picking up sticks. She straightened up to look at him. Please, would you fetch me a drink of water? Elijah asked. The drought had reached Sidon, and food and water were scarce there too, but the woman put down her basket and kindly set off to get him a drink. Please, would you bring me some bread to eat too? Elijah called after her. The woman turned back and shook her head sadly. I'm sorry, she said. I can't do that. I've been collecting these sticks for fire so that I can cook the last meal that my son and I shall eat. All I have left in the house is a little bit of flour in my bowl and a tiny drop of oil in my jar, just enough for a small loaf. Once we've eaten that, we shall die of hunger. Don't be frightened, Elijah said. Just do as I ask you. Make a little loaf for me first, and then use the rest to make one for yourself and your son. God promises that as long as the drought lasts, your bowl will never run out of flour, and your jar will never run out of oil. The woman believed Elijah and hurried off to do as he told her. God's promise came true. Elijah stayed with the widow and her son, as God had told him to, and each day she found enough flour and oil to make that day's bread. The next day there was enough for a fresh loaf. There was always enough to feed all 3 of them as long as the drought lasted. Elijah challenges Baal, a contest on the mountain. 3 years passed without a drop of dew or rain, and King Ahab grew desperate. One morning he set off with his chief manager, Obadiah. Obadiah still loved and served God and was a true friend to God's prophets. We'll cover the whole country, the king said, checking every stream and river. We'll see if there is enough water for our horses and mules. If not, we must slaughter them all. You go one way, and I'll go the other. Obadiah set off in the opposite direction from the king and began his search. There were many miles to walk. It was some time later when he looked up and had the biggest surprise in his life. There in front of him stood Elijah. Obadiah could not believe his eyes. I want you to bring King Ahab here, Elijah said. The king has been searching everywhere for you, Obadiah said. If I bring him back and find that you've disappeared again, he'll be furious. I'll still be here, Elijah promised. When Ahab set eyes on Elijah, he spoke rudely. Is it you, is it? Or it's you, isn't it? He asked. The one who has brought all of us this trouble? I'm not the one who's to blame, Elijah told the king gravely. You have turned away from God and followed Baal. Now call the people to Israel to come to the top of Mount Carmel. Bring all the prophets of Baal too. I am the only prophet of God that Jezebel has left alive, but I will stand up for God against them all. God sends fire. King Ahab called everyone together as Elijah had said. The people stood waiting, wondering what would happen next. Elijah stepped forward to speak to them. When are you people of Israel going to stop wavering and make up your minds, he asked. Decide who is a true God and serve him. If Baal is really God, serve him with all your heart. But if my God, the God of Israel, is the one true God, then give him all your trust and obedience. You can't try to serve God and Baal. Today we shall hold a contest to find out which is the true God. Then Elijah turned to the Baal prophets. Build up an altar to Baal, he told them. Put wood on it and place a sacrifice to Baal on top, but don't set it on fire. Call on Baal to send fire himself to burn up his sacrifice. Baal was a god of rain and storm. He should be able to send lightning to set the sacrifice on fire. The Baal prophets prepared their altar and sacrificed carefully. Then they began to pray for fire to come down and burn it. The people watched in silence. Nothing happened. The prophets grew desperate, and their prayers became mad yells and screams. They danced wildly around the altar, tearing their hair and imploring Baal to hear them. Elijah began to tease them. Perhaps Baal is busy, he suggested, or he may have dropped off to sleep. Try to wake him up. In spite of all their wild shouts and capers, nothing at all happened. At last they collapsed, exhausted and hopeless. Then Elijah called the people to come close. First, he mended the broken-down altar of God that had once stood on the mountain. He laid wood and meat on it, and then dug a trench around it. Bring water and pour it over the sacrifice, he ordered. Large jars of precious water were brought, and the sacrifice, wood, altar, and all were thoroughly soaked. Bring more, Elijah said. By the time they had finished, the water was pouring off the altar into the trench below. Everyone could see that Elijah had a far harder task than the prophets of Baal. All that water would put out any fire. Calmly, Elijah began to pray. O God, you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Prove that you are still the God of Israel by sending fire. Immediately, the watching crowd saw flames light up the altar. In a moment, the sacrifice went up in smoke. Fierce fire burned up the wood and even the stones of the altar. It licked up the water in the trench and scorched the earth around. The people were amazed. They fell on their faces and shouted, God is the true God. He is the only God. Elijah ordered them to seize the prophets of Baal and put them to death. Only that way, he believed, could the wicked and cruel worship of Baal be stamped out of the land of Israel. The clouds gather. It was a very shaken King Ahab who listened to what Elijah had to say next. Go and eat now, he told the king. Soon the rain will come. The people went quietly to their homes. But Elijah and his servant climbed to the very top of the mountain. Elijah kneeled down, his head bowed low, praying and listening to God. Then he told his servants to go and look toward the sea. The servant came back. There's nothing to be seen, he reported. Look again, Elijah said. 6 times the servant did as Elijah said. 6 times he could see nothing unusual. But the 7th time he came back and told his master, I can see a tiny cloud on the horizon. It's no bigger than a man's hand. Then Elijah stood up. Go and tell Ahab to hurry home if he wants to get there before the rain comes, he said. By now Ahab had learned to believe what Elijah said. He gave orders for the chariot to be made ready. All this time clouds began to gather thick and fast. The wind began to blow. The whole sky was black and heavy with rain. Ahab set off quickly. Suddenly Elijah felt full of God's strength. He was triumphant and happy because of all that God had done that day. He hitched up his long robes, tucked them into his leather belt, and began to run. Ahab's palace at Jezreel was some 3-hour chariot drive from Carmel, but Elijah ran ahead of Ahab's galloping horses all the way to the city gates. Elijah, God's messenger. Danger. King Ahab arrived back at his palace in Jezreel and told his wife Jezebel all that had happened. When she heard what Elijah had done to her Baal prophets, she was furious. She stormed and raged and then sent a terrified servant with a message for Elijah. Tell that man, she shouted, that by this time tomorrow I shall have done to him exactly what he did to my prophets. May the gods strike me dead if I don't keep my promise. When Elijah heard the angry queen's words, his heart sank. The day before, he had bravely shown all of Israel, as well as their faint-hearted king, that God alone was great and powerful. But how could he bring them back to the true God while Jezebel ruled the kingdom? Without waiting a minute longer, Elijah set out south to the land of Judah. For a whole day he tramped through the brown desert country. Then, hot and exhausted, he sat down in the shadow of a solitary tree. He wished he could die. "What's the use, God?" he asked. "For all the good I've done, I might as well be dead." Worn out, he fell fast asleep. Suddenly, he felt a touch on his shoulder. He woke up to hear a voice saying, "Have something to eat." To his amazement, Elijah found a loaf of bread and a jar of water ready beside him on the ground. He fell to hungrily, then lay down and fell fast asleep again. A second time the voice woke him. "Get up and have something to eat, or else the journey will be too much for you." By now Elijah was full awake. He felt better for the sleep and for the new supply of food and water so wonderfully provided. He knew that God did care about him. He had sent his special messenger to comfort him and make him strong. That food kept Elijah going for a long time. He went on with his journey until he came to Mount Sinai. This was a sacred mountain where God had spoken to their great leader Moses and had made a covenant with the people of Israel when he brought them up out of Egypt. The still small voice. When Elijah reached Mount Sinai, it was getting dark. He crept into a cave in the hill to spend the night there. But in the dark, God spoke to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God asked. Elijah told God just how he felt. "I'm the only one left on your side," he answered. "Jezebel has killed all your prophets, and your people have turned away from you to serve Baal." When Elijah stopped speaking, a sudden furious wind swept past the opening of the cave. It was as wild and strong as Elijah's own thoughts and feelings. It howled around the hillside, splitting open the rocks with its force. But God was not in the wind. The wind was still, and Elijah felt the earth beneath his feet stir and tremble. The ground heaved as an earthquake shook the foundations of the mountain. But God was not in the earthquake. Then Elijah saw a red glow. The dry shrubs began to blaze as a desert fire spread swiftly across the hillside, lighting up the night sky. But God was not in the fire. After the fire, Elijah heard the still small whisper of a voice. God was speaking to him now. With awe and wonder, Elijah wrapped his cloak over his face and went slowly out of the cave to stand in the open and listen to God. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God asked him again. Again, Elijah poured out his tale of woe. "Elijah," God said, "you are not the only person in Israel who loves and serves me. There are 7,000 other people who are loyal to me and refuse to worship Baal." Then God told Elijah what to do next. His work for God was not finished yet. God also said, "Go and anoint Elisha to be a prophet after you." God realized that Elijah needed a helper and friend. Elisha was the man who would be his companion and carry on his work when Elijah had gone.